Okay, hello everyone. My name's Elliot Morgan. I'm Head of Resources for TGLO, the Teacher Social Network. I'm going to talk to you today about vocabulary instruction, and specifically about how we can use it when we're teaching concepts, because we're often tasked with teaching abstract concepts to children. So first of all, what is vocabulary instruction? Well, put simply, is what the name suggests. It's instructing pupils about vocabulary. I think historically, people have viewed it as like this picture here, as just explaining a word's definition and children just passively receiving it and accepting it. Instead, I think we should view it as explaining a word's meaning. So a definition is an essential nature of something, while meaning is the idea or concept that is represented by a word. So instead, if we want it to be more effective, it should look like this. It should be an active process where pupils are participating and going beyond simple definitions. We should be constructing meaning together and viewing it as an active process. So there's an ongoing dialogue between teacher and pupil, and we need to negotiate meaning with them, not just convey it to them and they passively accept it. So when thinking about concepts we teach, I think we can boil it down. This may be oversimplifying it a bit, but boil it down to just two main types of concept: a fixed concept or a fuzzy concept. So we're going to start with fixed concepts. So Aristotle supposedly said that a real definition will give you the necessary and sufficient conditions for an object to be an instance of the concept. If we keep what he said in mind here, so a necessary condition, they must be present for the definition to be true. Sufficient condition, they alone are enough to make the definition true. If we use fire as an example, and imagine we're teaching that in a science lesson. Well, oxygen is a necessary condition of fire. Without it, fire cannot exist. However, oxygen alone is not a sufficient condition, so just having oxygen won't start a fire. So fire has three necessary conditions, the fire triangle. It needs oxygen, heat, and fuel. Each of those conditions there is necessary, but on their own, they're not sufficient. So if you just had one of them, you would not have a fire. And a condition is only necessary if the definition cannot occur without it. Therefore, if we took heat, fuel, or oxygen away, just one of them, the fire would go out. That makes it far easier to explain to children if we follow this fixed view of fire as a concept. It makes it far easier for us to explain it to them and then to have a more secure understanding of it. And if we then pose the question like, could you have fire in space? They can go through the necessary conditions in their head and go, well, actually, space is a vacuum. There's no oxygen, so you couldn't have a fire there unless it was inside the International Space Station or something like that. Alternatively is the fuzzy view. So a fuzzy view of a concept sort of suggests that there's no a firm meaning that we can assign to it, and it has loose boundaries and sort of fuzzy edges. So, and the examples of a concept, there can be varying degrees of an example. So before we delve deeper into this, just have a look at these four birds on the screen. I want you to rate them in your head from the most typical example of a bird to a least typical example of a bird. So in other words, which is the most birdie bird, which is the least birdie bird? Okay. So Meaning-Rosch looked at fuzzy meaning with her prototype theory. So prototype theory states that an example of a concept does not have to have a fixed number of characteristics, but it just needs to be a reasonable match. So the example itself would be judged against a prototype, which would go in sort of the center, would be the perfect or most typical example of that word. And then the further away from the prototype, so the further we get away from it, the less features an example would share with the prototype, and it would be less. It wouldn't be as good an example of that concept. So this wouldn't work if we were explaining the concept of fire, because all fires are a fire. There's no fire that is more fire-like than another. So when we're looking at words that have more fluid of a definition, or concepts that have more fluid definitions, then this fuzzy approach is much more appropriate. So Meaning-Rosch asked people participating in their experiment to grade birds, like I just asked you to do, from the most bird-like to the least bird-like. So we had a robin was deemed to be the most bird-like, the prototypical example. Canaries and bluebirds sort of in the middle, and then penguins and emus were deemed to be the least birdie bird. So that is they're deemed to be the least birdie-like. So I think it's fair to assume from this prototype that people had a view of a bird in their mind as something that's small, perhaps has a small neck, is a bit colourful, has wings and can fly. So a robin meets all of these criteria, and that's why it's the prototypical example of a bird. But on the contrary, emus and penguins were considered least birdie birds because they didn't really match those criteria other than having wings. Neither of them is particularly small, neither is colourful. Perhaps most importantly is that they're both flightless. So remember, in the fixed view of a concept, every example of that concept has equal footing. So every fire is equal to every other fire. No fire is more fire-like than another. But in this fuzzy view of concepts that this prototype theory is demonstrating, examples of a concept can resemble each other, but they're not necessarily equal. So we need to think about and consider when we use fixed and when we use fuzzy. So perhaps if I was explaining something like a living thing in a subject like science, I would say, well, it's got certain criteria you have to meet. It has to respire, it has to produce waste and grow and so on. And by setting out these necessary conditions, it makes it much easier for me to present examples and children to be able to tell me whether something's a living thing or not. So they can say that a rock has never been alive, a dog is alive, and a beef burger contains something that used to be alive. Whereas if I wanted to explain a concept like democracy in, say, a history lesson on the ancient Greeks or a secondary politics lesson, then a fuzzy view, a prototype theory might be a better approach, because there are varying examples of democracy. So a direct democracy might be the prototype, but it's very different from a representative democracy or an authoritarian democracy. Okay, so thanks for listening. I'm sorry I was rushing through that because it's a lot to get through in just 5 minutes. So I mentioned at the start that I work for Teglo. We're a teacher social network, so we've got blogs, tips, resources. We've got job adverts. You might have seen our blog post recently where we're sharing hundreds and hundreds of home learning resources that we found online. All these ones that are accessible for free. We've got a secondary one. We've got a primary one. So please do have a look at the website and join. Come and you can connect with me on there. You can connect with me on Twitter and Teglo on Twitter. We're also looking to build a bank of resources. So if you feel like you've got loads of great resources to share, then please do have a look at the website. But we're also looking to build a bank of free teacher CPD videos. So just like I'm doing with you now and everyone's doing BrewEd isolation, sharing free CPD of an area you're interested in or an expert in, you can share with our members globally. And we invite absolutely anybody and everybody, whether you're an NQT or someone who's been teaching for 30 years, everyone has their own voice and something to contribute. So please do get in contact if you think you'd be interested in that. And thanks for listening.